Hello and good day, class. Today we will be talking about Freud's psychosexual stages or his psychoanalysis stages of development. As you can observe, Freud's psychosexual stages is comprised of three phases and also three periods. The oral phase, anal phase, and the phallic phase comprises the infantile period, which is the first stage of psychosexual development, which is considered by Freud as the most crucial period for the personality formation. And the infantile period would also be succeeded by the latency and the genital periods later on. So, for us to easily memorize and recall Freud's psychosexual stages, let's just use the mnemonic OAPLG, in which we are just using the first letters of Freud's psychosexual stages, which refer to the oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital period. As previously mentioned, Freud divided the infantile stage into three phases according to which of the three primary erogenous zones is undergoing the most salient development. So the first phase is basically the oral phase, followed by the anal phase and then the phallic. So all three infantile stages overlap with one another, and each actually continues after the onset of the later stages. We could somehow recall that the mouth is the first organ to provide an infant with pleasure, and that's why Freud started with the oral phase. Infants obtain life sustaining nourishment through the oral cavity, but beyond that, they also gain pleasure through the act of sucking. So during the oral phase, the sexual aim is basically to incorporate or receive into one's body the object of choice, which is the nipple. And as they grow older, however, they are more likely to experience feelings of frustration and anxiety as a result of scheduled feedings, increased time lapses between feedings, like they would get frustrated whenever the mother would be delayed in providing the nourishment that they needed, and eventually weaning. So, in the process of weaning, it could somehow be so short that the breastfeeding only lasted for about 2 months or a month. And there is that sudden disruption of the nourishment that was previously enjoyed by the infant. As infants are weaned, they could experience anxiety and also ambivalence toward the mother, and they are bound to also defend themselves against the environment and any other forms of anxiety. That's why in the second oral phase, as soon as they get to also have teeth, they would defend themselves by also having that oral sadistic behavior through biting, cooing, closing their mouth, smiling, and even crying. For infants, their first autoerotic experience is thumb sucking, which is a defense against anxiety that satisfies their sexual but not their nutritional needs. And as you can remember with your general psychology, all the three phases include experiences of fixation. We know that fixation is also a kind of defense mechanism pertaining to the psychosexual stages of development. So, like, if a person did not receive appropriate gratification, like sudden weaning or sudden disruption of breastfeeding, so a person may also be fixated in a specific stage, or in this example, the oral phase, or a specific stage left a particular impression, or the person's personality would reflect that particular stage throughout their life. So that is actually what fixation is all about. So in this case, as children grow older, The mouth continues to be an erogenous zone, and by the time they become adults, they are likely capable of gratifying their oral needs in a variety of ways. So, again, this is a fixation in the oral stage. That's why some people may describe that you have an oral personality through behaviors relating to thumb sucking, sucking a candy, chewing a gum. So they have that habit of sucking a candy, chewing a gum, biting pencils, overeating, smoking cigarettes, pipes and cigars, and even making sarcastic remarks. So people, whenever they are verbally aggressive, likely have that oral personality, which tells us that they may be fixated at this particular phase or stage of the psychosexual development. Moving on to the next phase is the anal phase. So the early anal period is the time when children receive satisfaction by destroying or losing certain objects. We need to remember that the aggressive drive, which during the first year of life takes the form of oral sadism, and it reaches fuller development during the second year when the anus or the anus emerges as a sexually pleasurable zone. So by holding the feces or letting it go, so like for example, when infants are about to poop and they try as much as possible to stop themselves from defecating, or when they try to also release the feces through defecating, that is actually the time when they get to also experience pleasure, and that is through the sphincter muscle or our anus or anus. So at this time of the early anal period, the destructive nature of the sadistic drive is stronger than the erotic one, and children often behave aggressively toward their parents for frustrating them with toilet training or potty training. So during the second year of life, parents most probably would spend their time trying to also negotiate, trying to educate, telling their children that whenever they feel the urge to poop, they must also go to the restroom, or they first must be trained on how to also do potty training. And then during the late anal period, they sometimes take a friendly interest toward their feces, which is an interest that stems from the erotic pleasure of defecating. Frequently, children will present their feces to the parents as a valued prize, according to Freud. So, if their behavior is accepted and praised by their parents, then children are likely to grow into generous and magnanimous adults. However, if their gift is rejected in a punitive fashion, children may adopt another method of obtaining anal pleasure by withholding the feces until the pleasure or the pressure becomes both painful and erotically stimulating. So let me put that back again. So if children are basically praised because they were able to also learn, and the parents were successful in potty training them, then they could also likely grow as generous and magnanimous adults, meaning they are likely to surpass this particular phase successfully, according to Freud. But then, if they are rejected, then likely they may actually stop themselves from pooping, and they are likely to withhold their feces until it would become painful, or it may later become erotically stimulating on their part. Now, this mode of narcissistic and masochistic pleasure lays the foundation for the anal character or the anal personality. These are people who continue to receive erotic satisfaction by keeping and possessing objects and by arranging them in an excessively neat and orderly fashion. Freud hypothesized that people who grow into having the anal character back when they were still children, they were overly resistant, meaning they were not listening to their parents, they were not potty trained, or their parents were not successful in potty training them, and they often hold back their feces and they prolong the time of training beyond that usually is required for them. So this anal eroticism becomes transformed into the anal triad of orderliness, stinginess, and obstinacy that typifies the adult anal character. So again, this is another form of fixation wherein people are fixated with orderliness, stinginess. So they are not giving, they are not also generous. And another is that they are obstinate, they are hard headed, and they are not likely to listen to what other people are saying. Now, the anal character or the anal stage is also being associated with people who may also have challenges in making decisions. So when people don't likely make decisions of their own, they are likely to also have that anal character or anal fixation. Now, moving forward to the phallic phase. The male Oedipus complex is the rivalry toward the father and the incestuous feelings toward the mother. And likely at age 3 or 4, children are likely to also experience castration anxiety or the fear of losing the penis. And this is likely happening to the males. While on the other hand, female Oedipus complex happens when they also have that desire for sexual intercourse with their own father and accompanying feelings of hostility toward the mother. And compared to the males, females are likely to experience penis envy because they become envious of the appearance and they feel cheated and they desire to have a penis of their own, because at this particular stage Freud somehow described that the penis is a symbol for power. So try to consider this diagram. So the mother is basically the one giving nourishment to the child and is likely to also uh, observed by the child that the mother also cares for the father, and at the same time the father also loves the mother. So when the child begins to explore what is with the father that makes the mother love him, so that is the time when the child could also observe that the penis is likely a symbol for power. So in order for him to be loved, so the male child sees that the father has a penis and he desires to also have his mother. And the boy now sees his father as a rival for the mother's love. And he desires to do away with his father and possess his mother in a sexual relationship. So this is what they call as the Oedipus Complex. So it is taken from the Greek tragedy by Sophocles, in which the Oedipus, the king of Thebes, is destined by fate to kill his own father and marry his own mother. But according to Freud, before a young boy enters the Oedipus complex stage, he develops some amount of a feminine disposition. So during the Oedipal period, therefore, his feminine nature may lead him to display affection toward his father and express hostility toward the mother. But while at the same time, his masculine tendency disposes him toward hostility for the father and lust for the mother. And during the ambivalent condition known as the complete Oedipus complex, affection And hostility coexist because one or both feelings may be unconscious. And Freud believed that these feelings of ambivalence in a boy, which is the castration complex, may actually be taken in a form of castration anxiety. As castration anxiety would happen, the child begins to also check with the father, and since the father is seen to be bigger than him, then the child also begins to surrender, or the Oedipus complex might be dissolved or repressed, and the incestuous desires are likely to be replaced with feelings of tender love and begins to develop a kind of primitive ego. And Freud identified that the male child may likely identify with either the father or the mother, depending on the strength of the feminine disposition. But normally, identification is with the father. And in this process, the boy doesn't want to be his father, but instead, he uses his father as a model for determining right and wrong behavior. Meaning, he then introjects or incorporates his father's authority into his own ego, thereby sowing the seeds of mature superego. So in this mature superego, it takes his father's prohibitions against incest and ensures the continued repression of the Oedipus complex. So this is when we could also observe that male child embracing his own masculinity after using his father's identity as a model for himself, thereby formulating his own mature superego. On the other end, the female Oedipus complex or the Electra complex is quite complicated as a path because, according to Freud, the experience of the females of the penis envy is a powerful force in the formation of the girl's personality. Unlike castration anxiety, the penis envy may last for years in one form or another. Freud believed that the penis envy is often expressed as a wish to be a boy or a desire to have a man, and almost universally it is carried over into a wish to have a baby, and eventually it may find expression in the act of giving birth to a baby, especially a boy. For a female child, initially, the female child fantasizes and wants to identify with her own mother. And that fantasy of being seduced by the mother would later be turned into hostility when the girl holds her mother responsible for bringing her into the world without a penis. And her libido is then turned toward her father, who can satisfy her wish for a penis by giving her a baby, an object that to her has become a substitute for the phallus. So, if you are familiar with the story of Electra, as a princess, she was actually searching for a man whom she would get married with, and then all the soldiers who participated to a competition to win her hand, eventually all of them died, and then she ended up marrying her own father, who was the king. Now, that desire for sexual intercourse with the father and accompanying feelings of hostility for the mother is what we call as the simple female Oedipus complex, or some people would say it is Electra complex. Now, this simple female Oedipus complex would be resolved when a girl gives up masturbatory activity, surrenders her sexual desire for her father, and again identifies with her own mother. However, the female Oedipus complex is usually broken up more slowly and less completely than is the male's because of the super ego that is likely built from the relics of the shattered Oedipus complex. Freud believed that the girl's superego is usually weaker, more flexible, and less severe than boys. And the reason the girl's superego is not as strict as the boys is traceable to the difference between the sexes during their Oedipal histories. For boys, castration anxiety follows the Oedipus complex, breaks it up nearly completely, and renders unnecessary the continued expenditure of psychic energy on its remnants. Once the Oedipus complex is shattered, energy used to maintain it is free to establish a superego. For girls, however, the Oedipus complex follows the castration complex or the penis envy, and because girls do not experience a threat of castration, they experience no traumatic sudden shock, and the female complex is only incompletely resolved by the girl's gradual realization that she may lose the love of her mother and that sexual intercourse with the father is not forthcoming. So her libido thus remains partially expended to maintain the castration complex and its relics, and thereby blocking some psychic energy that might otherwise be used to build a strong super ego. So what does that mean? Meaning to say, girls would somehow have that gradual realization that the Oedipal desires for the father or having a sexual intercourse with the father are self-defeating, and that's why they would resolve the Electra complex or the female Oedipus complex through identifying once again with their own mother, and the weak superego as identified by Freud replaces the partially dissolved Oedipus complex. Moving forward to the latency period. So, Freud believed that from the fourth or fifth year until puberty, this is actually the period for the latency, and both boys and girls go through a period of dormant psychosexual development. And so, the latency period is also brought about by partly deterring sexual activity by the parents with their young children. So they are likely to discourage or punish their kids if they are also doing any sexual activity, may it be masturbation or earlier forms of sexual exploration or even sexual contact. And if parental suppression is successful, children will repress their sexual drive and direct their psychic energy towards school, friendships, hobbies, and other non sexual activities. So, if we are to also follow Freud's theory of the unconscious motivation, then we would also be understanding that those who likely become competitive in academic performances, may it be in extracurricular activities or any other activities, just as long as the sexual contents and the sexual drives are still dormant, then likely they are rechanneling their libido into these activities. And we should remember that continued latency is reinforced through constant suppression by parents and their teachers and by internal feelings of shame, guilt, and morality. So the sexual drive, of course, still exists during latency, but its aim has been inhibited. So the sublimated libido now shows itself in social and cultural accomplishments, and during this time, children form groups or cliques, an impossibility during the infantile period when the sexual drive was completely autoerotic. Now, moving to the genital period, puberty signals a reawakening of the sexual aim and beginning of the genital period. So first, adolescents give up autoerotic eroticism, and their direct they likely redirect their sexual energy toward another person instead of having it towards themselves. And second is that reproduction is now possible. And third, although the penis envy may continue to linger in girls, the vagina finally obtains the same status for them that the penis had for them during infancy. And parallel to this, boys now see the female organ as a sought after object rather than a source of trauma. And the entire sexual drive takes on a more complete organization, and the component drives that had operated somewhat independently during the early infantile period gain a kind of synthesis during adolescence. Thus, the mouth, the anus, and the other pleasure producing areas take an auxiliary position to the genitals, which now attain supremacy as an erogenous zone. And likely, the genital period begins at puberty and continues throughout the individual's lifetime, and this is likely the stage attained by everyone who reaches physical maturity. And Freud alluded but never fully conceptualized a period of psychological maturity, which is defined as a stage attained after a person has passed through the earlier developmental periods in ideal manner. Now, moving forward, at this particular section, we will be talking about applications of the psychoanalytic theory. So remember that Freud somehow conceptualized that there are existing conflicts, and we also have the ego instincts and the sex instincts. Now, imagine a person who has this confusion as to why is he having some forms of hatred towards the sibling or a certain brother or even a younger sister. Now, there could be a possibility that a certain experience was actually repressed, like a certain demand for a toy wasn't granted by the parents, and then um, the that wish coming from the younger sibling might actually just have been given by the parents right away without even giving explanations. Now, that older sibling might actually have repressed that hatred against the younger sibling, right? And then that information could be relegated back into the unconscious, meaning to say it is repressed back into the unconscious, that specific memory or experience. Now, we know for a fact that we have that sensor as described by Freud, meaning to say our unconscious may not likely be easily be presented into our consciousness or the conscious stream of awareness. It's because of the sensor. Likely, the sensor protects us from experiencing overwhelming anxiety. Now, that experience of the older sibling might actually be repressed for a long time, like several years, and then only to also come out because of a certain symptom or a certain triggering experience. And then likely it could also be that the older sibling is not aware of that, but still that specific memory was triggered by a certain event, like for example, um, that sibling somehow tried once again to also ask for a favor from the parents, and then he wasn't given or wasn't granted with such wish. Now, what would happen is likely the person might actually experience another or use another form of defense mechanism called regression by trying to also act like a child or be going back to the earlier um, period of life where he felt secure and safe for himself. And then suddenly, when the younger sibling was there, it could be that he or she was actually conscious about what he has done, that that older sibling might actually kick the younger sibling through a form of displacement. And then few years once again would pass, and then another triggering situation might actually happen, and that older sibling might actually use another defense mechanism through reaction formation or even projection. So what am I trying to emphasize here? I'm trying to let you somehow see that a specific repressed memory experience may likely be unearthed in different forms of experiences, leading for the person to also utilize or use many different defense mechanisms. Now, in this particular illustration, we could understand that the basis of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy is to destroy the repression so that there will be no symptom. So the moment the repressed memory is destroyed, or that repression is destroyed, there is no more symptom, or there are no more symptoms, meaning that is what we call as an abrogated condition. So there are no more symptoms. Abrogated condition. The battleground of psychoanalysis is with transference of the client to the therapist. So this is the time when the therapist would be seen by the client as a person who likely resembles that individual whom he or she has issues with. And we are also reminded that psychoanalysis started as a theory of neurosis. Freud never intended to make a dynamics of personality. Now, talking about controversies, with his prime motivation of behavior, which is the unconscious, that is somehow making his theory more controversial. And in every neurotic pattern that exists, it stems from a sexual conflict. Neurotic symptoms have meanings in the same way as parapraxis, just like Freudian slips, and there is always meaning to it. So neurosis is a state of mind characterized by 1. Overreaction to reality, like reality anxiety and also neurotic anxiety. Everyone has a dosage of neurosis in differing levels, as I also previously mentioned. 2. The presence of unnecessary anxiety, meaning that anxiety is misplaced. Okay, there is that presence of anxiety in the person that he or she feels that it is something that is likely to happen, but that is misplaced somewhere else. And also avoidance rather than coping, meaning where ego function follows. So we would be learning further that repression is the cornerstone of every neurotic symptom. Without repression, there are no symptoms. And repression is not just in a form of visual memory. It could be in two forms. One could be, it could be ideational. Two, there is energy attached to that idea. So meaning there is a characteristic in terms of event and reason. Repressed materials are repressed energies. As you go on through the years, if there is a threat, you go back. So you may also go back, or meaning to say you can actually regress, or there is regression as also utilized as a defense mechanism, which is also the repressed process could be fixation. So meaning to say, projection could be the byproduct of repression, and the symptom is the product of displacement. If you look into the illustration once again, I would like to emphasize this one. Projection could be the byproduct of repression, okay? And then symptoms like triggering events or emotions could be the product of displacement. So you might also ask the question, what causes the repression? So what causes repression? It is likely because of the conflict between the sex instinct and the ego instinct. So remember Freud's life and death instinct? Those are actually the conflicts that would likely arise. And that is because they are in a constant conflict. And that could be the main source of why people are using repression as a defense mechanism. And the superego is just a function of the ego. The superego grows. The reservoir of the psychic energy is the id, which operates in the pleasure principle and has no connection to reality. And that's why it's called a primary process. And it can be put into the cathexis to the ego. And the id will let reality answer. So moving forward to Freud's early therapeutic technique. Freud utilized hypnosis and also dream interpretation. Freud told his patients to expect for scenes of childhood sexual experiences would likely come by the time he would touch their head, and he would also induce hypnosis on them. In his autobiography, Freud stated that under the pressure technique, under or using hypnosis and dream interpretation, he was actually able to also let his patients reproduce childhood scenes in which they were sexually seduced by some adult. And when he was obliged to recognize that these scenes of seduction had never taken place and that they were only fantasies which his patients had made up, he described that as he was listening to his patients, trying to also tell him that they were just fantasies and they didn't actually happen, then he also expressed that he was at a loss. And in time, Freud came to realize that his highly suggestive and even coercive tactics may have elicited memories of seduction from his patients, and that he lacked clear evidence that these memories were real. Freud became increasingly convinced that neurotic symptoms were related to childhood fantasies rather than the material reality, and he gradually adopted a more passive psychotherapeutic technique. So moving forward to Freud's later therapeutic technique. So he still actually utilized his couch, and then this time the primary goal of his psychoanalytic theory or therapy was to uncover repressed memories through free association and dream analysis. With free association, patients are required to verbalize every thought that comes into their mind, no matter how irrelevant or repugnant it may appear. For Freud, the purpose of free association is to arrive at the unconscious by starting with a present conscious idea and then following it through a train of associations to wherever it leads. So, like for example, when a client would somehow be asked to share whatever word is in her head or his head. So, like when the client would somehow say black, and then he or she would continue to also associate the word black by saying night, dark, horrifying, and many other related or associated terms. Later, Freud somehow realized that the process is not easy and some patients never master it, and for this reason, dream analysis remained a favorite therapeutic technique with Freud. You may also notice that transference is also a term which is very common in the process of psychotherapy. So, transference is a strong sexual or aggressive feelings. It could either also be a positive or a negative feeling that patients develop toward their analyst during the course of treatment. So, to a certain extent, transference may actually be a positive thing towards the psychotherapist or psychoanalyst, because if their patients would likely be experiencing that, then that could also be utilized as an element where the therapeutic alliance or therapeutic intervention might actually happen. So let's say, for example, the client or the patient is likely seeing the psychoanalyst as his brother, whom he or she has issues with, then that could be utilized by the psychoanalyst as an element in dealing with that specific issue. Or if the on the other hand, the patient may also be having some positive feelings like affection or attraction towards a psychoanalyst, then the psychoanalyst could likely also utilize that by being effective in the therapeutic alliance or relationship. But we need to also take note that the psychoanalyst would not also fall into that trap of also expressing affection or positive affect or feelings for the patient, because it's also a big no-no at this time. In the time of Freud, it might actually be acceptable, but still socially it was also a violation. And this time, um, it is also a violation of the psychotherapist's profession. And when the psychotherapist or the psychoanalyst would likely have that positive or love or affection towards the client, then that is also what we call as the counter transference. So moving forward to dream analysis, Freud used dream analysis to transform the manifest content of dreams to the more important latent content. So the manifest content of a dream is the surface meaning or the conscious description given by the dreamer, whereas the latent content refers to its unconscious material. So the basic assumption of Freud's dream analysis is that nearly all dreams are wish fulfillments. Some wishes are obvious and are expressed through manifest content, as when a person goes to sleep hungry and dreams of eating large quantities of delicious food. Most wish fulfillments, however, are expressed in the latent content, and only dream interpretation can uncover that wish. An exception to the rule that dreams are wish fulfillments is found in patients suffering from a traumatic experience. The dreams of these people follow principle of repetition compulsion rather than wish fulfillment. So meaning to say, there is that presence of intrusive thoughts. And these dreams are frequently found in people with post-traumatic stress disorder who repeatedly dream of frightening or traumatic experiences. Okay. Freud believed in his dream analysis that dreams are formed in the unconscious, but they try to work their way to the conscious. To become conscious, dreams must slip past both the primary and the final sensors, and even during sleep, the guardians maintain their vigil and forcing the unconscious psychic material to adopt as a disguised form. Now, for example, when a client would also be sharing his or her dream to you and you are the psychoanalyst, so likely your manifest content might actually be the starting setting of the dream. So, like when your patient would likely be describing that uh, he or she was in a room, or likely let's refer to a female example. She is in a room. Um, she actually saw a baby, and then later the latent content might actually lead into something else, deeper, and must be psychoanalyzed by the person. So this is just an example. So when the client somehow saw a baby, then there's a sudden shift of setting where it was a sudden shift where the dreamer or the patient saw and described that she was in the restroom or in the comfort room, and then she was also able to describe feces. Now, if you are the psychoanalyst, you could somehow be describing that these three elements, a baby, a restroom, and also feces or poop, may actually mean something, and they could be associated or related. Like when you would somehow be interpreting that dream, that woman, maybe she was pressured to conceive a baby, to have a baby, but she is not ready yet. And the restroom is just like um, a room for rumination. She keeps on thinking about having a baby, if she is ready or not. But then, in the end, there is that presence of the feces or the poop, meaning to say she totally dislikes it. There is that process of elimination when you talk about feces. So, meaning to say she tries not to think about it, or she dislikes the idea of pregnancy, or she doesn't want to bear a child because she is just pressured by some certain forces in the environment.